The rain fell with a percussive fury the night Frank Miller threw his stepdaughter out. It wasn't a gentle spring shower, it was a hard, accusing downpour that hammered the shingles of the small house and turned the dusty street into a slick of running mud. Maeve stood on the porch, the worn fabric of her single satchel growing dark with moisture. The door clicked shut behind her, the sound as final as a coffin lid. She didn't turn. She had already seen the last she ever wanted to see of his face, the tight set of his jaw, the cold satisfaction in his eyes. Too many books, he'd grumbled, his voice thick with whiskey and resentment. Fills a girl's head with nonsense. No room for common sense, to Frank, was knowing your place. Her place, apparently, was not here. Inside the satchel was everything she owned, a change of clothes, a small book of poetry whose spine was soft from handling, a half-eaten apple, and the small amount of money she'd saved from mending clothes for the dressmaker. It wasn't enough for a ticket to anywhere, and even if it were, she had nowhere to go. The rain plastered her brown hair to her scalp, trickling in cold rivulets down her neck. She was 18 years old, and the world had just shrunk to the size of a muddy street in a town that had never quite felt like home. She walked, not toward the faint lights of the saloon or the mercantile, but away from them, toward the dark edge of town where the woods began. Each step was a deliberate act of leaving. She wasn't running, she was marching into exile. The weight of the satchel was negligible, but the weight of his words pressed down on her, heavier than the water-soaked air. Too smart. It was an accusation he'd leveled for years, whenever she'd corrected his sums or read a passage from the newspaper he couldn't decipher. It was her curiosity, her quiet competence, that he couldn't abide. It made him feel small, and Frank Miller could not tolerate feeling small. She found a sliver of shelter under the deep eaves of the abandoned livery stable at the town's periphery. The wood was rotten and smelled of decay and damp earth, but it was a roof. She huddled against the wall, pulling her thin shawl tighter, and watched the rain. It wasn't just water falling from the sky, it was a curtain dropping on the first act of her life. There was no one to cry to, no one to appeal to. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. And in that cold, damp solitude, a strange clarity began to form. He had taken his house from her. He had taken her name, her sense of belonging. But he could not take the mind he so despised. A quiet, cold anger began to thaw the shock in her veins. He wanted her to have no place? Fine. She would make one. The next morning broke grey and sullen, the world washed clean and smelling of wet pine. Maeve walked out from her meager shelter, her clothes stiff and damp. She ate the rest of her apple, the crisp snap of it a small, defiant sound in the quiet air. Instead of looking back at the town, a collection of low-slung buildings huddled in the valley, she looked up. Her gaze followed the gentle slope of the land that rose behind the livery, a long, green hill that most people ignored. And there, at the crest of the rise, stood the oak. It wasn't just a tree, it was a landmark, a titan of bark and leaf that had stood for centuries. Its trunk was a gnarled column of immense girth, and its lowest branches, thick as a grown man's waist, reached out like sheltering arms a good 30 feet from the ground. It was a fortress built by nature. Maeve walked toward it, the wet grass soaking the hem of her skirt. The townspeople rarely came up here. It was too far from the creek, too exposed to the wind. It was useless land. To Maeve, it felt like the safest place in the world. She stood at its base, craning her neck to see where the highest branches pierced the grey sky. It was absurdly, impossibly tall. From up there, you could see everything, the whole of the town nestled by the winding path of the Blackwood Creek, the distant plains, the jagged peaks of the mountains to the west. From up there, the town and its judgments would look small. The idea that had been a spark of anger the night before now caught fire. A house! Not on the ground, where a man like Frank could kick her out of it. Not on land someone could claim. But up there. Suspended between earth and sky, belonging to nothing and no one but the person who built it. A treehouse. Not the flimsy plaything of children, but a shelter. A bastion. A place that could not be taken. It was a mad thought, born of desperation and defiance. She had no tools to speak of, no lumber, no experience beyond watching the town carpenter and reading diagrams in borrowed books. But she had her mind. She had her hands. And she had a deep, burning need for a place that was hers alone. She spent the rest of the day studying the tree, walking its circumference, testing the strength of the lower limbs, mapping its architecture in her head. She saw the perfect cradle formed by 3 massive, diverging branches. That would be the foundation. She saw how the canopy would provide shelter from the sun and a buffer from the wind. She saw not just a tree, but a promise. That evening, she did not return to the livery. She slept at the base of the great oak, her back against its solid, unyielding trunk, and for the first time since the door slammed shut, she felt the barest flicker of something that was not despair. It felt like resolve. With the first of her meager funds, she bought a hammer, a handsaw, and a small sack of assorted nails from Mr. Abernathy at the general store. He was a kind, stooped man with flour-dusted spectacles who didn't ask questions. He simply nodded as he counted out her change, his eyes holding a flicker of sympathy. The tools felt heavy and real in her hands, instruments of creation. The rest of her materials would have to be found. She became a ghost, a scavenger haunting the edges of the town. Her first discovery was a collapsed shed behind the old tannery, its wood weathered grey but still sound. She spent 2 days painstakingly prying the boards loose with the claw of her hammer, stacking them into manageable piles. The work was brutal. Her hands, accustomed to the fine work of a needle, were soon raw with blisters that broke, bled, and hardened into calluses. Splinters became a constant nuisance. Her muscles ached with a deep, unfamiliar fire. Each board had to be dragged up the long slope to the oak, a punishing journey she made over and over until a small mountain of reclaimed lumber sat at its base. Then came the problem of getting it up into the tree. She solved it with a rope, also purchased from Mr. Abernathy, and a system of knots she'd read about in a book on sailing. She would climb into the lower branches, haul the rope up, tie it securely, then descend to tie off a board and painstakingly pull it up, hand over aching hand. The process was agonizingly slow. Days blurred into a rhythm of scavenging, dragging, and hoisting. She found more wood near the creek, remnants of a washed-out bridge from a spring storm years ago. She found discarded crates behind the saloon, which she broke down for their thinner, lighter planks. Every nail was precious. She would straighten bent ones on a flat rock, her hammer taps echoing in the quiet woods. She learned the language of the wood, the whine of the saw as it bit into pine, the solid thud of a nail sinking into oak, the groan of a board settling under her weight. Her first task was the platform. It had to be level and strong enough to hold not just her, but the weight of the walls and roof to come. She spent a week just building the support frame, anchoring thick beams directly to the massive limbs of the oak, checking her work not with a spirit level she didn't own, but by sight and feel, by the way a small stone rolled or stayed put. It was imperfect, but it was solid. She worked from dawn until the light failed, fueled by stale bread and a fierce, solitary focus. The world shrank to the tree, the wood, the hammer in her hand. The memory of Frank's sneer became the rhythm of her work, too smart for your own good, each hammer blow seemed to say. And with each nail she drove home, she answered back, this is my common sense. It was inevitable that the town would notice. At first, it was just a curiosity. A few of the ranch hands riding past would rein in their horses, gawking up at the strange structure taking shape in the old oak. Their curiosity soon curdled into mockery. Look at Miller's girl, building a nest for herself, one of them shouted, his laughter carrying on the wind. The name stuck. They called it Maeve's Nest. The women of the town were quieter but no less cruel. They'd whisper behind their hands as she walked through town to buy what little food she could afford. Poor thing, they'd murmur, their pity more scalding than any insult. Gone simple with grief, Maeve learned to ignore them. She kept her eyes down, her expression neutral. Their words were just noise, a distraction from the task at hand. Their laughter couldn't loosen a single nail she'd hammered. Their pity couldn't weaken the floorboards beneath her feet. But then the mockery gained an official voice. Sheriff Brody rode up the hill one afternoon, his horse picking its way carefully around her piles of lumber. He was a man who liked order, and Maeve's project was a messy, unorthodox disruption. He stayed on his horse, looking down at her. "Miss Miller," he began, his tone a strained attempt at civility. "What exactly is the meaning of this?" "I'm building a house," Maeve said simply, not stopping her work of measuring a board. "This is town land," he said, gesturing vaguely at the hill. "You can't just build a thing up in a tree. Is there a law against it?" she asked, her voice even. Her directness seemed to fluster him. "Well, no, not specifically, but it's an eyesore. It's not proper." "People are talking, let them talk," she said, and made a mark on the plank with a piece of charcoal. The sheriff's face tightened. "This is a warning. Take it down. I don't want to have to come back here." He wheeled his horse around and rode off without another word. The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. For the first time, a sliver of doubt pierced her resolve. He could come back with men. He could tear down everything she had painstakingly built. That evening, as dusk settled, she felt the familiar chill of despair creeping back. She was tired, hungry, and now, threatened. As she was packing up her tools for the night, she saw a figure walking up the hill. It was Mr. Abernathy from the store. He carried a small cloth-wrapped parcel. He didn't say much, just pressed it into her hands. "Figured you could use this," he mumbled, avoiding her eyes. "Payment for that mending you did for my wife last year." Forgot about it until now. He turned and walked away before she could protest. Inside the parcel was a thick slab of bacon, a small loaf of fresh bread, and a sealed tin of coffee. And tucked into the cloth was a small, heavy box of new, straight nails. It wasn't charity. He had framed it as a transaction, a debt paid, to preserve her pride. Maeve sat on her half-finished platform as darkness fell, the smell of fresh bread filling the air. It was a small gesture in a world of dismissal, but it was enough. Someone saw her not as a fool or a lunatic, but as a person. The sheriff's threat still loomed, but Mr. Abernathy's kindness had reinforced more than just her supply of nails. It had reinforced her spirit. The sheriff's warning spurred her to work with a new, frantic urgency. The platform was complete, a solid deck of mismatched boards high above the ground. Now came the walls. Sleep became a luxury she could rarely afford, stealing a few hours each night wrapped in a thin blanket on the open platform, the stars brilliant and close above her. She felt like she was living on the deck of a ship, sailing through a sea of black sky. The walls went up one plank at a time. She had no way to build a traditional frame, so she overlapped the boards, nailing them to the platform floor and to each other, creating a solid, if unlovely, shell. It was slow, precarious work. She had to brace herself against the tree trunk, leaning out over the dizzying drop to hammer nails into place. She developed a cat-like sense of balance, her body learning to trust the structure she was building. Her world was a vertical one, lived on ropes and narrow beams. She devised a pulley system using a scavenged wheel and more rope, which made hauling up lumber slightly less backbreaking. It was a testament to the practical knowledge she'd absorbed from books, levers, fulcrums, load-bearing angles. The very things her stepfather had called useless nonsense were now the architecture of her survival. The town's derision grew in proportion to her progress. Now that her creation had walls and was beginning to resemble a crude shack in the sky, it was no longer just an oddity. It was an affront. It was a visible, permanent declaration of her refusal to conform, to be broken, to disappear. Clara, the blacksmith's daughter, was among the most vocal of her peers. "Look at her up there," Clara would say to her friends, pointing from the town square. "Thinks she's a queen in her castle of splinters." Maeve heard the comments. She saw the pointing fingers. But the physical reality of her shelter was more powerful than their scorn. Inside the rough walls, the wind was blunted. The space was hers. It was safe. Sheriff Brody returned, as promised. This time he dismounted, his boots making soft thuds on the damp earth. He stared up at the enclosed box, his hands on his hips. "I told you to take this down, miss," he called up, his voice tight with frustration. "I'm not bothering anyone," Maeve called back from the edge of her platform. You're making a spectacle. This is not how respectable people live. I am giving you 1 week. 1 week, and then I'm coming back with men and axes. This nonsense ends. He didn't wait for a reply. The ultimatum was clear. 7 days. A week to finish, a week to brace for the demolition of her entire world. The threat was no longer abstract. It had a deadline. That night, a storm rolled in, and the first true test of her workmanship arrived. The wind howled through the branches, and the rain came down in sheets. The structure groaned and creaked, a chorus of stressed wood, but it held. Maeve lay inside her small enclosure, listening to the symphony of the storm, feeling the immense power of the tree as it swayed, absorbing the wind's fury. She wasn't frightened. Every creak was a joint she had fastened. Every groan was a nail she had driven. She knew its weaknesses and its strengths. It was a part of her. The storm passed by morning, leaving the air washed and clear. The deadline remained. 7 days. With the sheriff's deadline looming, Maeve's focus narrowed to a single point, the roof. A shelter without a roof was just a box. She had saved the best, widest planks for this, knowing they needed to overlap perfectly to shed water. It was the most dangerous part of the construction. She had to work on top of the walls, with nothing but 30 feet of air beneath her. She worked methodically, her fear a cold knot in her stomach that she refused to acknowledge. She laid the first boards, then covered the seams with strips of tarpaulin she'd scavenged from a pile of refuse behind the mercantile. It was ugly, but it would be functional. While she worked, she noticed a change in the air. The sky had a strange, yellowish tint, and the clouds on the horizon were a bruised purple. The rain that began to fall in the afternoon was different from the storm a few nights before. It was a quiet, persistent, soaking rain that seemed determined to saturate the very earth. Down in the town, people grumbled about the mud and the dreary weather, but no one seemed truly concerned. The Blackwood Creek often ran high in the late autumn. It was a seasonal annoyance. But from her high perch, Maeve saw something they couldn't. She had a panoramic view of the entire valley. She could see how the creek, normally a lazy brown ribbon, was now swollen and churning, its color a thick, angry ochre. She saw how the water in the low-lying fields wasn't draining away. It was pooling, spreading, turning pasture into marsh. The relentless rain was falling on earth that could no longer absorb it. She remembered a passage in a geology book she'd read about flash floods in narrow valleys, about how a week of steady rain in the mountains could turn a tame creek into a monster without warning. A cold dread, far sharper than her fear of the sheriff, settled over her. His deadline no longer mattered. A far more absolute deadline was approaching. She abandoned the aesthetic touches she'd planned and focused on pure survival. She spent an entire day sealing every crack in her walls with a sticky, foul-smelling pine tar she bought from Mr. Abernathy, using the last of her money. She reinforced the anchors holding the platform to the tree. She hauled up her remaining supplies, the last of her dried meat, a full bucket of clean water, her single spare blanket. Her little shack was no longer just a house, it was becoming an ark. The rain did not stop. It drummed on her newly finished roof with a monotonous, hypnotic rhythm. For 2 days, it was the only sound in the world. The creek was a brown torrent now, spilling over its banks in the lower parts of town. The bridge was submerged. Still, no one seemed to panic. They moved their livestock to slightly higher ground, stacked sandbags in front of their doorways, and waited for the rain to cease. They were used to the creek's moods. They did not understand that this was different. Maeve watched, a helpless, solitary observer. She felt a frantic urge to shout a warning, but who would listen to the mad girl in the tree? They would laugh at her. They would call her a hysterical fool. So she said nothing. She just watched, and prepared. The end came in the night. Maeve was jolted awake not by the sound of the rain, but by its absence, replaced by a deep, guttural roar that vibrated through the very wood of the tree. It was the sound of the world coming apart. She scrambled to the small, unglazed window she had cut in the west-facing wall. In the faint moonlight, she saw a terrifying sight. It wasn't a creek anymore. It was an inland sea. A churning, debris-filled wall of water was surging down the valley, erasing everything in its path. The dam of earth and rock somewhere upstream, the one the old-timers always worried about, must have finally given way. The water didn't just rise, it advanced. She watched in horror as it consumed the tannery, then the livery. Lights flickered on in the houses below as people were woken by the noise. Shouts of panic and fear were swallowed by the monstrous roar of the flood. The town square, the heart of the community, disappeared under a roiling brown tide. The water slammed into buildings with the force of a battering ram, splintering wood and shattering glass. The sound of destruction was horrifying. Maeve felt a tremor run through the oak as a huge log, once part of the bridge, crashed against its trunk. The entire structure shuddered, but the deep roots held fast. From her vantage point, she was safe, an observer of an apocalypse. She could see figures scrambling onto their roofs, their forms silhouetted against the chaos. The church, which sat on a small hill, was supposed to be the town's designated refuge in an emergency. But the water was rising faster than anyone could have imagined. The hill was rapidly becoming an island, and the water was still climbing. Her own hill, once the subject of scorn, was now the highest point of land for miles. The great oak was the only true sanctuary. She watched as the current tore a house from its foundation and sent it spinning downstream like a child's toy. The scale of the disaster was absolute. This wasn't a flood, it was an erasure. Her little treehouse, her nest, the folly that everyone had laughed at, was now one of the only solid, dry places left. The irony was so bitter it felt like acid in her throat. She had built it to escape the town, to wall herself off from their judgment. Now, it was a lonely watchtower overlooking their destruction. Her solitude, once a shield, now felt like a curse. She gripped the windowsill, her knuckles white, her creation a silent witness to the end of the world as she knew it. As dawn broke, a scene of biblical devastation was revealed. The town was gone, replaced by a vast, swirling lake of muddy water filled with the wreckage of homes, furniture, and lives. The only things visible were the tops of the tallest buildings and the scattered islands of high ground. The church steeple jutted from the water, its bell silent. On the rapidly shrinking island where the church stood, a small, desperate group of survivors huddled together. Among them, she could make out Sheriff Brody, his uniform caked in mud. The water was still rising, slowly but inexorably licking at the edges of their refuge. Panic was etched on their faces even from this distance. Soon, their island would be gone too. They began to look around, their eyes searching for any hope of escape. And then, one by one, they saw it. They saw the great oak, standing resolute on its high ground. And they saw the impossible structure nestled in its branches. They saw her. A figure shouted and pointed. Soon, they were all looking, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and dawning, desperate hope. The current between their hill and hers was strong, but the distance was not impossible. Sheriff Brody, a man stripped of all authority but the will to live, cupped his hands around his mouth. "Hello the tree," he bellowed, his voice raw. "Can you help us?" All the mockery, all the threats, all the condescension, had been washed away. He was just a man asking for help from the girl he had threatened to tear down. Maeve's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the moment of reversal she could never have imagined. Her private sanctuary was about to be breached. For a fleeting second, she considered doing nothing. She could stay safe and dry, alone, and let them face the consequences of their own short-sightedness. The thought was ugly, and she pushed it away almost as soon as it formed. She had built her house to survive, not to preside over a graveyard. She grabbed her longest, thickest rope. Bracing herself, she called back, her voice thin against the water's raw but clear. "I have a rope. The current is too strong to swim." They understood. They found a long, heavy plank from the church's broken fence. A couple of the men, Brody included, waded into the churning water, pushing the plank ahead of them, fighting the current, trying to bridge the gap. It was a desperate, exhausting struggle. Maeve, meanwhile, tied her rope securely to the thickest part of the oak's trunk. She waited, her muscles tense. When they were as close as they could get, Brody shouted, "Throw it!" Maeve coiled the rope and threw with all her might. It fell short. Her heart sank. Again, he yelled. She pulled it back, her hands raw from the wet hemp. She took a deep breath, judged the wind and the distance, and threw again. This time, it landed across their plank. A collective cry of relief went up. They secured their end, and a fragile lifeline now connected her world to theirs. One by one, they began to cross, pulling themselves hand over hand through the treacherous water, the rope their only guide. She pulled from her end, her arms screaming with the strain, helping to haul them toward the safety of the hill. The first person to collapse at the base of the oak was Clara, the blacksmith's daughter. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror and shock. She looked from the raging water to Maeve, standing above her. The derision was gone, replaced by a raw, humbling gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. Then came the sheriff, exhausted and beaten. He looked up at Maeve, then at the solid, well-built structure in the tree. He didn't have to say a word. The admission of his failure, and her triumph, was written plainly on his face. The hours that followed were a strange, suspended reality. There were 8 of them in total: Sheriff Brody, Clara, Mr. Abernathy, his wife, and 4 other townsfolk Maeve barely knew. They huddled in her small, one-room treehouse, a space built for one now crammed with survivors. The floorboards she had so carefully laid groaned under the combined weight, but they held. The walls she had sealed against the wind now sheltered them from the ongoing rain. The awkwardness was a palpable thing. These were the people who had mocked her, dismissed her, threatened her. Now they were guests in her refuge, their lives dependent on her foresight. Maeve shared what little she had, her water, her dried meat, her blankets. They took it with a quiet, shamed reverence. No one spoke of the past. They spoke in hushed tones of what they had seen, of who was missing, of the terrifying power of the water. From their high window, they were silent witnesses to the slow, lingering death of their town. They watched as the church was finally overcome, the water swallowing it completely. They saw rooftops break apart and float away. Each piece of debris was a memory, a piece of a life now gone. Mr. Abernathy's wife began to weep silently, her husband's arm around her. The general store, their life's work, was completely submerged. Clara sat by the wall, shivering, staring out at the devastation. "My father," she whispered to no one in particular. He went back inside to get the cash box. No one knew what to say. There were no words of comfort that weren't also a lie. Sheriff Brody, stripped of his badge and his authority, seemed the most lost of all. He just stared at the walls of the treehouse, at the sturdy construction, the clever pulley by the entrance, the neatly sealed seams. He was a man of rules and regulations, of predictable outcomes. Maeve and her impossible house were an equation he could never have solved. "You knew," he said, his voice flat. "It wasn't a question." "I didn't know," Maeve corrected him quietly. "I just looked." The water wasn't going down. The ground couldn't take any more. It was so simple, an observation available to anyone who had bothered to look up from their own feet. That was the most damning truth of all. They had all been warned, not by a prophet, but by the sky and the earth. They had just been too busy, too certain, too grounded in their ways to see it. For 2 days they lived like that, a small, cramped pocket of humanity suspended above the flood. The water crested on the second day and then, with agonizing slowness, began to recede. It left behind a world coated in a thick, grey-brown sludge. The landscape was unrecognizable, a wasteland of mud, mangled trees, and the skeletal remains of buildings. When the ground at the base of the oak was finally clear, they descended, one by one, back into the ruined world. The silence was the most shocking part. The roar of the water had been replaced by a profound, tomb-like quiet. As they stood on the muddy ground, they all looked back up at the treehouse. It was no longer Maeve's nest or Miller's folly. It was the ark. Sheriff Brody walked over to Maeve. he stood before her, not as a lawman, but as a man who owed her his life. "The town council, what's left of it, will want to thank you," he said. Then he added, his voice low and heavy with the weight of his own foolishness, "This land. This hill. It's yours. No one will ever question it again." In the weeks and months that followed, the survivors of the Great Flood of 1895 began the grim, arduous task of rebuilding. The story of what happened spread through the territory, a cautionary tale of nature's fury and a town's hubris. But within that larger story was a smaller, more personal legend, the story of the girl who built a house in a tree and saved the town's remnant. Maeve's status shifted overnight. She was no longer an outcast. She was a savior, a seer. The transformation was unsettling. People who had once sneered at her now approached with a kind of reverent awe. They brought her things, salvaged tools far better than her own, bags of flour, smoked hams, bolts of cloth. They weren't gifts of charity, but offerings of gratitude and respect. A group of men, led by the blacksmith who had miraculously survived by clinging to a floating roof, came to her hill. "We want to help you make it stronger," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For what you did, Maeve, accustomed to solitude, found this new attention difficult." But she accepted their help. They helped her replace the scavenged planks with new, milled lumber. They helped her install a small, glazed window, a real one, that looked out over the valley. They built her a sturdy, permanent ladder to replace her rope system. They did not take over the project, they offered their skills in service of her vision. The treehouse was transformed. It was still her creation, but now it was fortified by the community. It became a permanent fixture, a symbol of the flood and the resilience of those who had endured it. They started calling it the Watch Oak, and Maeve, its quiet keeper. She never moved back down into the valley. The treehouse was her home, the only one she had ever truly had. She found a new purpose. From her high vantage point, she became the town's unofficial weather watcher. Her opinion on the clouds, the wind, and the level of the creek was sought after and respected. She kept records, made charts, and studied patterns, turning her love of books and observation into a practical, life-saving skill. The scars of her past didn't simply vanish. The memory of the slammed door, of her stepfather's cold eyes, was a part of her foundation, as integral to her structure as the oak's branches. But it no longer defined her. She had taken the pain of her rejection and hammered it into a home. She had built a place for herself in a world that had told her she had none. One clear, cold evening, she stood at her new window, looking down at the fledgling lights of the rebuilt town. It was smaller now, humbler, scarred but surviving. She was not one of them, not truly, but she was no longer separate. She was connected to them by a shared trauma and a shared survival. She had built a refuge from the world, only to find that in doing so, she had built a new place within it. Her place. Earned not by birthright or by marriage, but by the slow, steady, defiant work of her own two hands.